Alright, so this video is going to cover the olfactory system. So remember that olfaction is the scientific name for your sense of smell. So olfaction equals smell. So the general anatomy of olfaction is what I want to go through first. Basically, here's your nose and here's your mouth. And this is kind of a weird looking picture, but here's your nose and here's your mouth. There are your lips. So you have a cavity within your nose. This is called the nasal cavity. And this is what fills up with mucus when you get the flu. And then here is your oral cavity. Your oral cavity. And this is nowhere near anatomically correct, but here's your tongue. And this is what's got those taste receptor cells on it and stuff like that. But since we're talking about olfaction, what we want to do is cover the fact that the oral cavity and the nasal cavity are connected. And so this right here is bone. More specifically, this part right here is called the cribriform plate. So basically what happens is you have odorants, and I like to draw them as little molecule-looking things, like that. So an odorant molecule gets into your nose, and it enters your nasal cavity. However, because of the way your oral cavity and your nasal cavity are connected, odorants can actually also come from your oral cavity. So the food that you're chewing can also send odorants up like that. So those can also come from the oral cavity. And this is important with flavor. So flavor isn't just the perception of a taste. It's the integration of olfaction, taste, so gustation, and touch, things like capsaicin, which is spicy, and somatosensation. So there's a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex. And this equals the flavor cortex. So when you say, oh, this gum is minty, that's not a taste, that's a flavor. And that's a combination of both what's likely, a sweet, sugary experience coming from the gum itself, but also things like mint that are traveling up the back of this region where the nasal cavity and the oral cavity connect, and those odorants are interacting with your olfactory receptor neurons. So if we zoom in even more, right, and this orbitofrontal cortex, that's a higher area of cortex. So if we zoom in here, we have this region called the olfactory epithelium. And within the olfactory epithelium, or embedded within this region, are olfactory receptor neurons, and they've got these little cilia things. And I'll get rid of these just so you guys can see this better. But basically you have your olfactory receptor neurons, which project through this area of bone called the cribriform plate and make synapses in the olfactory bulb. So I'm going to draw this. I'm going to highlight it orange. So this is your olfactory bulb. And then this is the pathway it takes to get to cortex. So it goes like that, back to the brain. And this via the olfactory tract. Tract to, I'm going to say central nervous system. Although, no, I'm not going to say that, because this is technically, because it's a neuron, this olfactory receptor neuron is the central nervous system. So I'll say brain here. So essentially what happens is these odorant molecules that I'm going to draw in red here, they'll bind to olfactory receptor neurons, right? And these aren't just the only ones. There's multiple. But they'll bind to them and transduce information about a specific odor. And that information is carried throughout the pathway in the olfactory tract. So basically what happens is these olfactory receptor neurons, these ORNs, which are embedded in the colors consistent olfactory epithelium, project through the cribriform plate, and contact areas called glomeruli. Or glomeruli. But basically what these are regions where similar olfactory receptor neurons converge. So each glomeruli, whatever the plural is going to correlate to one specific type of smell or one specific odorant. And then these are going to contact two different types of cells that make up the olfactory tract. So these are mitral cells and what are called tufted cells. So these are the ones that are going to make the olfactory tract. So, let's see, is there anything else I want to say? So when we talk about an odor, something like, let's say we're talking about mint. Mint doesn't occur as a result of one odorant binding to one olfactory receptor neuron and leading to the perception of mint. It's actually a combination of things. So it's called a combinatorial code. So what I'll say is olfaction works via combinatorial code. And what this means is that one single neuron or neuron type activating is not sufficient to produce a perception. Each smell that we can identify isn't one neuron activating, but a combination of neurons acting in conjunction with each other, so at the same time. So let's say mint has to do with four different, I'm just making this up, but four different odorants binding four different olfactory receptor neurons simultaneously. And that combination, that specific pattern of activation, is going to be what's this combinatorial code. So this is that idea that smell is a combination of multiple different smells at once. And so if you actually do this experiment, you can do it at home. If you take a jelly bean and you put it in your mouth and chew it up, but while you do that, you close your nose. So here's your jelly bean. Basically what happens is because your nose is closed, there's no airflow that goes through, because airflow usually goes like this, right? So it goes through your mouth and then out your nose. But if you close the nose, there's no reason for air to flow that way. So what happens is you don't actually get these odor molecules. You get an inability for this odor information to reach your nose. So if you chew this jelly bean for a while, you might be able to say, oh, this is definitely sugar. You can get a sense of the texture based on how it feels on your tongue. But it's not until you open your nose and allow that airflow to proceed throughout from your oral cavity to your nasal cavity that you can say, oh, well, that's mint, or that's strawberry, or whatever it is. Like the flavor, right, that converges on the orbitofrontal cortex in the brain, in the higher order brain regions, is responsible for determining the flavor of the gum you're chewing, not like whether it's sugary. And we'll talk about that in the next video. And the study guide kind of talks a little bit more about some of the more nitty-gritty details, but what I'm trying to get through with these videos is a more holistic sense of what's going on. So a more big picture ideas, because when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, which protein does what, you can just remember that. So you just kind of have to memorize that. So what I want to talk about is actually this idea that humans can track scents. So if you take a person, and this was widely disputed for a long time, people thought humans' olfactory systems were actually relatively primitive. But if you take a person and you put headphones on them, noise-canceling headphones so they can't hear, So you take audition out of the equation. No more audition. You give them oven mitts, so touch is out of the equation. They still have vestibular, they still have their sense of balance, so you can't really do anything about that. You can't really shut down their vestibular system without them protesting. But you can also put on a blindfold. So you blindfold them. So there goes their vision. So what's left is taste, which isn't really going to matter because you're not putting any sugars or anything in your mouth, so ignore that. Basically, all you have left is kind of vestibular, but that's just important for daily functioning. Basically, what you have is olfaction only. And when you're limited to only that, what they can do is they can take a grassy field, take essential chocolate oil, and kind of spritz it across the field, and they make you get on, they make this poor person get on their hands and knees and smell their way around this field, with their headphones and their blindfold. And basically what happens is they can follow this trail pretty reasonably well. And my pen is deciding not to work. But there we go. So they can follow this trail with outstanding accuracy if you deprive all their other senses. And what this gets across is that humans can actually use smell for tracking, maybe not to the same degree that dogs can, but it is possible. So our olfactory system is actually relatively advanced, or more advanced than we would think it is. So the olfactory system, what's interesting about it is that it kind of skips the thalamus and eventually gets to the thalamus. But what it first does is it projects to areas like the limbic system and the amygdala in the limbic system, the hippocampus, and the piriform cortex, which is the conscious appreciation of smell. And what's interesting about the piriform cortex is, so if here's your olfactory receptor neuron, and if you want more details about like how these olfactory receptor neurons transduce, I would definitely do the study guides because those are going to be a lot more helpful than me explaining it. But basically what happens is, here's your olfactory receptor neuron, projects through the cribriform plate to the mitral cells and tufted cells, which project to multiple different areas. So they project to the piriform cortex. I don't know if I'm spelling this right, but piriform cortex. They project to the amygdala. And if you've ever experienced intense emotion as a result of smell, that's because your amygdala and your olfactory system are actually very interconnected. You might remember from the limbic lecture that we have entire regions of the amygdala devoted to processing olfactory information. You also have projections that go straight to the hippocampus. This is also due to that association, right? You smell something like Play-Doh that you haven't played with since you were a kid, but it brings forth this emotionally charged memory because both your hippocampus and your amygdala had, throughout the course of your development, had worked so intensely to try to produce this emotional linkage between the two. So, like I said, the piriform cortex eventually does project to thalamus, and this is for integration with other sensory systems, yada, yada, yada. But one thing that's interesting about the piriform cortex itself is that it's evolutionarily archaic. Evolutionarily. And what's interesting about that is it's actually called archicortex. And it's hypothesized as one of the first structures, so one of the first central nervous system structures to develop, throughout the course of evolution. And this is because chemodetection, so the ability to detect chemicals in the environment, was likely based on very simple mechanisms in maybe even bacteria or prokaryotes, or even like multicellular but single-celled organisms, mechanisms they have to detect chemicals in their environment and move towards them. So again, take a look at the study guide for more about like the transduction pathways, but this should give you a sense of what you need to know overall.